We're now going to have a bit of a Q&A, so we're going to ask Andy a lot of difficult questions, and I'm very happy not to have to answer all these questions. We're going to go through what you've put on the website and whatever has been voted the most. So I'm going to start with the first one.
Okay.
How do you reconcile the existence of natural disasters and suffering with the idea of a loving and all-powerful God?
Fantastic. What an amazing question. Thank you. And what a nice, easy question to get us going. Thank you for, avoiding the softball. Like, what's your favorite color? What do we do when we come to things like, natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, disease, that kind of thing? Well, the first thing I want to say is a couple, I want to say three things, actually. That's a massive question in its own right. And if you want to dig deeper into it, a friend of mine who is a brilliant scientist based at Oxford University called Sharon Dirks, her name is a really complicated one to spell, D-I-R-C-K-X, Sharon Dirks. She is a brain imaging scientist from Oxford University originally. She's got a brand new book just out called Broken Planet, which goes into that in detail. So that's a question you really want to explore in more detail. Sharon's book I can recommend. But let me offer just three thoughts on that question. First thing is, what's interesting is that all of us instinctively make a moral response when we see suffering. When a tsunami hits a poor country and many suffer, when COVID broke out and the pandemic began, when there's an earthquake, our response normally isn't, oh, well, that's interesting, that's just atoms doing what atoms do. Normally we have a response of, we were indignant. We say, that shouldn't be allowed, that shouldn't be right. We make amazing sacrifices sometimes. COVID is fascinating, right? We shut down our entire country. We locked down perfectly healthy people. We arguably wrecked our economy to protect people who are old and infirm and weak. If we were going to be strict evolutionists, we might have gone instead, hey, COVID is great. It's thinning the herd and removing the weak so the strong survive. Nobody in this room, I hope, instinctively responded that way. Rather, our instinctive reaction was the very opposite of the natural one. This is terrible. We must do something to look after the weak and the infirm. Very interesting. And again, as I say, when personally we're struck by tragedy, when perhaps we get a terrifying health diagnosis or whatever, our reaction is not to go, oh, well, that's just nature. We tend to make the moral response. Why me? This is not right. So we instinctively know the world is not functioning the way it should be. Which is interestingly, because that's the Bible's response. The Bible would say, actually, it's not just human beings who are not living correctly in relationship with God, but our rebellion against our Creator has actually damaged creation, and the whole of creation is out of kilter. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is that sometimes when we think about evil and injustice and suffering, we try and make this distinction. We'll try and say, well, over here we have moral evil. So we have, murderers and rapists and Putin and all this kind of stuff. Human beings engaging in morally reprehensible actions. And over here, we have earthquakes and disease and so on. I don't think it's quite so easy to separate those categories as you might imagine. Very interesting when you look at things like earthquakes. For example, my sister-in-law lived in Los Angeles for many years. There were several minor earthquakes when she was there. No one died. Earthquakes of the same magnitude hit poor parts of the world around the same time. Many people died. In other words, when we have something like an earthquake or a tsunami or disease, it's amazing how much poverty makes a massive difference. During the height of the AIDS crisis, this was remarked. If you look at the deaths in places like Africa due to HIV and AIDS, that was made far worse by the behavior of greedy Western pharmaceutical companies not making cheap drugs available for poorer countries. So actually, it's not always as easy to separate human moral evil and natural evil as we would think. And then third thing I'd say very briefly, I think the Bible is absolutely clear that evil in all of its forms is not the last word, that God has put a rescue plan for us and creation into effect in and through Jesus. And the whole news of what Jesus did at Easter is not just about the offer of you or I being put back into right relationship and adopted into God's family, but actually ultimately is about putting creation back into order.
The next one is, if faith and science are compatible, why are so many scientists atheists?
Brilliant question.
You can give them your book.
I confess I cheated slightly because Nico sent me the questions that are coming in this afternoon. I saw that one, so being a geek, I thought I know the answer to that, but I need the stats. It's actually a myth that the majority of scientists don't have faith. Let me give you some stats and then the story. The stats are these. In 2016, there was a big multinational study led by Professor Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice University in the States, looking at this very question. And she and her team of statisticians surveyed 10,000 scientists, 8 countries. 70% of those scientists had a PhD or higher. So we're talking really, really smart men and women. And it's interesting to look at what the results were of that study into faith and science. Only 25% of that cohort of scientists said there is no God. So yes, one quarter were atheists, but 75% weren't. Interestingly, 40% agreed to the statement, I am religious. So not merely there might be something out there, but we're actively religious. Only 24% saw there being any conflict between faith and science. That's interesting. So even some of the atheists didn't see there being a conflict. And in fact, 70% went further and said there is not and has never been any conflict between science and religion. So I think it's a myth, actually. And we had more time, we'd explore where that myth came from. But personal story, on top of all that data I threw at you. A few years ago, I was at Cambridge University speaking, got chatting to a lady who worked in the physics department there. And she was a Christian, and I happened to say, I thought it must be quite tough, I guess, because, like the person who asked this question, assuming she worked in a fairly secular department, she went, oh my word, no. She said, it's really easy being in physics and being a Christian. I went, why? She said, I'm surrounded by theists. It is by far the biggest worldview in my department are people who either are Christian or Muslim or Jewish, but who believe in something out there. She said, tiny minority would say there's absolutely nothing. She said, biology, on the other hand, the next building over, that's different. That's all full of secularists. I said, why is that? Her answer was, I hope there aren't any biologists here. She said, biology, that's just dissection. She said, when you're messing around with the fundamental building blocks of the universe and you see mathematics and order everywhere, you have to be blind to not conclude there is at least a mind behind the universe. Because as Einstein, who we began with, said, it appears that God has written the laws of physics in the language of mathematics. And we stumble across that every day in this department. And so she said the majority of her colleagues would be that sort of ranging from either something quite committed or to at very least there must be something. So that very simply and politely, I think it's a myth that the majority of scientists would be atheistic.
That's brilliant. When I was at university, my teacher in Physics 4, which was a kind of last bit of physics, did all the kind of Einstein and all the last bit. He said it's very hard to understand this universe without a creator. So it's quite similar to what you were saying. Next question, and this is kind of connected to the other one. Can you believe in God and evolution?
It's very tempting to go, yes, next question. Absolutely, you can. And to go, as the proof of that, actually, if you're a Christian here, Christians hold a variety of views on God and evolution. So if you're interested more in the theology of that, come talk to Nico after. In fact, I'll give you his mobile number later. 3 a.m, he's got nothing else on. He'll talk you through the theology of that. But the philosophy of that is simply that the Bible is very clear that there is a creator, but the mechanics of exactly how God created are up for grabs. And it's interesting, actually, we see this in the history of science. We see, for example, when Darwin first first published his book we now know as The Origin of the Species, some of his greatest defenders were Christians, were clergymen who said, this is amazing. He has revealed the incredible order that God has used to bring creation together. It was much later that actually this became a sort of weapon in the culture wars. And then more up to date, one of the most influential biologists in the last 10 to 20 years is Francis Collins. Collins headed up a project known as the Human Genome Project, which was the research project to first fully categorize and document the human genome, unlocking all kinds of possible advances in medicine. Francis Collins, committed Christian, becomes a Christian at university while studying the sciences. And if you want to see his story of how those things fit together, Collins' book, The Language of God, is a brilliant read. And actually, I think the title of that hints at the fact that, just like when you delve down into physics, the bottom level in physics is mathematics, is order and structure. What's interesting, we now see the same in biology. When you dig down to the lowest level of biology, we see that everything alive has a genome, has its DNA code, which is effectively a biological programming language. We find order and mathematics wherever we look. And that, again, is a very powerful argument for the existence of some kind of mind behind the universe. So the answer is yes, you absolutely can reconcile them. And if that's a question you want to wrestle with, Francis Collins' Language of God is a wonderful read.
Brilliant. So a lot of what you said kind of talked about there is a God or there is a creator. And the next question is, in your opinion, why is Christianity right and all the other religions incorrect, since all religions obviously believe they are right?
Yeah, well, that's a great, wonderful question. And actually, the great thing is we should give that book to whoever asked that question, because that is the topic of that book I wrote. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Let me say a couple of things briefly, because again, that's a massive question, so thank you for whoever asked it. The first thing I'd say, of course, it's not just religious people who think they're right. I have yet to, most of my atheist friends, I think, are convinced they're right. I think if we were to bring, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist from Oxford, and say, Richard, do you think that you're just one option and that actually everybody else is equally right? I think Richard might be quite strident on that in fact atheism is indeed true. Because most of us believe that our worldview, our view of reality is true. So then the question becomes, how do we put these things to the test? Because we can't all be right. I mean, clearly atheism and theism can't both be right. And clearly Christianity and Islam can't both be right. To give you just one very simple illustration of that, at the heart of the Christian faith stands that story that Jesus was crucified sometime in the early 30s AD by the Roman procurator Pilate and arose from the grave 3 days later. That's a historical claim. It's not some sort of weird sort of philosophical claim. We're talking history at this point. Along comes the Quran 600 years later, and it denies that Jesus was crucified. So we now have crucified or not crucified. It's not possible to be both. Being crucified is a rather binary thing. You either are or you aren't. So the Quran or the Gospels, one of them is clearly incorrect, and that's just one of many contradictions. So the answer is we have to do the hard work of actually exploring the religious options out there, and including within that atheism and humanism. Don't assume if you're an atheist here this evening, well, that's okay. My view is the default position. It isn't. I think all of us, no matter what we believe, need to be able to give good reasons for what we believe, and we need to have perhaps looked at the alternatives out there. And I happen to believe that the evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus stand head and shoulders above anything else. And that primarily is why I'm a Christian. That would be a topic for a whole other evening. But highly recommend do Muslims and Christians worship the same God, for somebody could win that. And if you go to the SOLAS website, and we're going to give you some cards on the way out with a little QR code on, we've got a part of our website at SOLAS where we have about 160 short videos answering almost every question, every question we could think of. There may be others, but there's some really good videos in there from myself and other colleagues looking at variations on that question you've just asked this evening, whoever asked that, so that would let you dig a little deeper.
Enjoy it. So now there's two or three questions are quite similar.
Okay.
They have to do with the creation story. So if the Bible says, yes, it was created in 6 days, how could that happen? And then the kind of question about if Adam and Eve were the only couple on earth, what happened with the kids? They kind of have incest or...
Okay, I thought, sorry, there was more in there.
It's kind of...
Yeah. The big issue we're dealing with the book of Genesis and Origins, of course, we're dealing with the challenge of a book that was written to people who are pre-scientific. So whilst I fully believe God could completely reveal the theory of relativity had he chosen to, that wouldn't have meant a lot. And before we get very superior and think, well, so much bully for them, you think about what it would be like if we wanted to have revealed to us scientific advances from 2,000 years in the future. We like to think we're quite advanced, but in the standpoint of history, we're going to look pretty primitive. And so what the challenge for God was to tell us the story of how things begin in a way that made sense then, in a way that is useful to us now, but also that makes the main thing the main thing. And I would say the book of Genesis, Nico, is not primarily concerned with all the nuts and bolts of exactly the order of things and the time scales. It takes the whole of creation and it puts it into that sort of 7-day format because it's a very easy way to understand things. But there are clues even there in the text that a day is not meant to be interpreted as a strict 24-hour period. I think if you read it carefully, that's there. Similarly with the question of Adam and Eve, actually, the story of Adam and Eve being created, sure, focuses on the first human couple, but it's very clear if you just read the text that God must have created others. Because when Cain and Abel have their famous interaction, and Cain kills his brother, if you know the Genesis story, which happens shortly after God has created the world, we're then told that as Cain is sent out into the world, God puts a mark on him so that others don't hurt him. And even an attentive reader of the text is going to go, well, what other human beings are around at this point? Well, the answer is clearly God has created others. But the lens of the story, the camera has focused on Adam and Eve. So I think reading carefully and well and realizing what is the main thing that Genesis is trying to tell us. It's trying to tell us that God created everything from nothing. It's trying to tell us that we're designed for a relationship with him. It's trying to tell us that humanity is in rebellion. And it's trying to tell us some of the consequences of that, those big picture pieces. The moment you start asking the text questions it wasn't designed to answer, then I think you get into trouble.
Yeah, and it's explaining in like 3 chapters, really small chapters,
Absolutely.
a lot of information, so it's obviously not all there. So another one there is, it's just moved around, so I've lost it. So if God is all-knowing, that means he knows the future. In that case, surely he knows everything everyone will do. Does that contradict the idea of free will?
Oh, my word. We've gone from biology to origins to philosophy, and I've got to have my coffee, Nico. Free will is interesting, actually. Let's just talk about free will just for a second. It often doesn't occur to people. I meet many of my friends who are wholly secular who get very excited about freedom. I mean, arguably, freedom is the chief virtue in our culture, right? We like to believe we can do what we want, how we want, with whom we want, where we want, when we want. We like to believe we are free. Choosing everything from my identity to my job to my friends, is central. This idea of sort of self-creation in Western culture. But if we live in a godless universe, let's run that imagination. Let's imagine that for a moment, he says cheekily. And if we live in a godless universe, there is no freedom. All there are atoms and particles in motion. In fact, it gets worse than that. Those atoms and particles that are moving around according to the deterministic laws of physics also are moving in your brain right now. And the reason each of you are thinking what you're thinking is not because you are rational free agents. It's simply because your brain chemistry is fizzing a particular way. There is literally no freedom. And in fact, Francis Crick, famous biologist, co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, committed atheist, famously said, "You are nothing but a pack of neurons." That's what you are. Any idea that you are free is a total myth. So the first thing is to say, well, if we believe in freedom, atheism is not the worldview to go for. Many other religions are not the worldview to go for, actually. Islam, which I've spent my 25 years of my academic career studying, is pretty darn deterministic, actually. Mainstream Islamic thought has even held that to talk about causation in science is blasphemous. If I drop Nico's phone, this will scare him. I won't drop your phone. If I were to drop his phone, it falls to the ground. It's not because of the law of gravity. It's because Allah is literally dragging it down. There is no causation. There are no laws of physics. Everything is the will of God. Now, Christianity and Christians throughout history have always thought and explored and talked about freedom and God's sovereignty. And in fact, the Bible affirms both. The Bible is very clear that, yes, God knows the future, and God is sovereign. God has set the whole system up. But also within that, the Bible is also very clear that you and I have significant freedom. How those things are fully reconciled, I think we could be here till midnight talking about the philosophical options, but the Bible affirms them both. One thing I found helpful through the years to think about is this: does God know the future because he's determined it, or does he know the future because he simply knows my free choices? So, for example, if I get up tomorrow morning and have cornflakes for breakfast, God will always known that I will have cornflakes for breakfast. If I get up tomorrow and have Scotch oats for breakfast, see Dundee for 6 years, it doesn't matter. God will always have known that I'll have Scotch oats for breakfast tomorrow. It's not that it's predetermined, it's my free choice that determines the content of God's knowledge. I told you this is a big philosophical idea. So the two are not irreconcilable, but if you believe in freedom, you need to look hard at Christianity. It is the only worldview, I believe, that offers space for freedom and significant freedom. There is certainly no freedom on atheism, none.
Brilliant. So we're going to finish by 9:10. So I have a last question, which is one of the ones that's there.
Brilliant.
It has, even if it's proof that there is a God, or that, how do we know it's one, it's singular? And secondly is, how can we know that creator's still alive? How do we know that it might have not kind of died a million years ago? So, really interesting question.
Great, that's a great question. Well, the first thing I would say, actually, that is a really awesome thought to think about, especially at 3 a.m. if you can't sleep. This is a great one to lie on your bed thinking about. I think the thing that I get excited about as a believer in God, as a Christian, is not that God set the whole thing going and then disappeared off. There are religious views that have that kind of God, a God who kind of wound up the clockwork of the universe and then disappeared off, never to be seen again. But the Christian view of creation is that actually God upholds everything. If God wasn't there, everything would cease to exist. And in fact, one of the oldest philosophical questions of all is why there is something rather than nothing. And the Christian answer to that would be, A, because God brought it into existence, but B, it's dependent on God for its existence. And lie on your bed at night and think about every atom that makes you up, every atom of the bed, every molecule in the room, every particle jiggling around somewhere in the universe is only there because God is giving it existence. That will blow your mind, unless you've had a couple of whiskeys, in which case you'll feel very chilled. It's a very exciting idea. So the very fact we are still here, I would say, is the argument against God having sort of somehow gone AWOL. But how can we know what God is like and God's nature and these things? I would say that's another massive question, but a couple of observations. Tonight we've talked about kind of sort of, a fairly sort of ground level question, really, God and science. And I would say actually science, rather than disprove God, points to the fact there's a creator behind it all. If we had more time, I would want to unpack that topic of human rights that I very briefly talked about, because I think it's very obvious that we live in a moral universe. I think it's very obvious that human beings have value and worth and dignity. I think there's a very powerful argument there, not just for there being a creator, but there being a personal creator who has endowed us with value and dignity. That gets us a bit closer to what kind of God we're talking about. But these kind of arguments only get us so far. If God is sort of out there in the fog somewhere, we might work a few things out from science and philosophy and so forth. What we really need, if God is out there in the mist somewhere, we need someone to come to us, as it were, out of the mist and tell us what God is like, which is what Christians believe has happened in the person of Jesus. And I would say, if you want to take a look at Christianity, if you want to investigate the possibility that the God that we've talked about this evening might be real and might be very interested in you, sure, you can think about philosophical ideas, but take a look at Jesus. Because if his claims stand up, and he didn't claim just to be some religious teacher, he claimed to be God come in space and time and history. And if those claims stand up, and I think they do, then the answer to the question, what is God like? As a Christian, I would say take a look at Jesus. And in about 3 weeks' time here, the Alpha course is beginning, which is a brilliant opportunity to do that. You've got more talks, you can do discussion, there's food, you've got food, right? There's food, what's not to like? And that will give you a really good opportunity to explore that question with others who are interested in checking out who Jesus is. So that would be my answer to that. Take a look at Jesus. Don't just think about God in the abstract.
So, brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Shall we give him a round of applause?